Alright, so welcome to video 5 in the study of Thomas Aquinas' Metaphysics. This video will continue the discussion of esse and essence. Now, esse is the act of being, but it's left transliterated, really untranslated from Latin in order to communicate the precise technical sense that Thomas Aquinas intended for that word. And for Thomas Aquinas, esse as the act of being is not self-limiting, as would be for God, but is rather limited by the limiting principle of the individual being who is the recipient of it in composition, limited by a distinct essence principle. Now, that's kind of a mouthful. What that means is that for Thomas Aquinas, participation in being for an imperfect being is participation in the etymological sense. It is taking a partial part of being, but that means that it's going to be imperfect. Now, of course, God perfectly embodies being, but that's because the distinction between the way that God has being and the way that a created thing has being is going to be a difference in the way that an individual being is able to have being through a certain composition by which that being can be the recipient of a being according to a limiting principle, which is that distinct essence principle of that being. Thus, these beings participate in esse on a real level rather than just logically intentionally. This is not just the logical abstraction or construct of being, but it's actually rather a really serious metaphysical principle. And that composition is going to be of a participating principle, for example, essence, nature, substance, right? That's what's participating, and the participated principle, which is the act of being. It's going to be that composition of essence, nature, substance, and the act of being, which is still going to lead you to a very complicated metaphysical problem that lingers in Aquinas' system. And of course, that problem is that if you are elevating essence to that extent, then how can there be many individuals of the same species who are still distinct individuals? And of course, within a medieval philosophy context, that problem is going to extend not only to the physically existing objects and entities of this world, but also is going to extend to the beings which are legitimately beings but are non-material, for example, angels. The way he's going to resolve this conflict is he's going to say that for material beings, form matter diversifies within a species. So, for example, the distinction of one individual of a given species from another individual of that same species is going to come down to the uniqueness of the form-matter composition for each member. So, this rhinoceros is not that rhinoceros. Although they're the same species, there is a uniqueness of the form-matter composition. But for non-material beings like angels, you cannot rely on that argument. Rather, Thomas Aquinas is going to make the somewhat radical statement, conclusion, that each angel is its own species. But of course, the distinction from one individual to the other is further complicated in classical Aquinas fashion by the way that for finite beings in his system, there is a center of existence in itself for each individual, but there's also certain aspects present in each that does not exist in itself, but exists only in something else. Now, that's a matter which is going to have to lead you to deal with the problem of substance and accident. Now, contrary to expectation, Aquinas actually goes far beyond Aristotle in this regard. For him, the substance-accident composition is actually much broader than the matter-form composition. In Metaphysics 4, for example, Aristotle notes the problem of the equivocation of being, using the same word to refer to different things and calling them all being. But Aquinas notes that the primary sense, of the referent of being is substance, but there are still really 4 modes of being. For example, first, the weakest exists only in the order of thought. This is the mode of being for negations and privations. To the extent that a negation or a privation exists, it's in the weakest sense only in the order of thought. Second is also the second weakest, which is that which still contains an admixture of negation and privation. For example, generation, corruption, motion. These are concepts which, not exactly at the level of a privation itself, still contains a mixture of the notion of negation privation in order for you to understand them. The third weakest do not exist in their own right, but only in something else. For example, qualities, quantities, properties of substance do not exist in itself, but rather only in something else. And what that something else is, of course, is the fourth and most perfect class of what exists, and that is that which exists per se without privation, and that, of course, is substance. And therefore, following Aristotle's Metaphysics 5, Aristotle lists four modes of substance. First, that by which substances are substances, for example, simple bodies like earth, fire, water, the type of elements of the the physics really of his day. And then there are the substances that are the subject of predications. The second sense or mode of substance is the intrinsic formal cause of such substances. Third is the parts of such substances that limit them and render them divisible. For example, surfaces, lines, points, numbers. Thomas rejects these, however, as properties of substance. And then fourth, the quiddity of a thing, the essence of a thing included with substance. Thomas reduces this list that Aristotle gave to him and to us really just to two categories, right? That by which substance is the subject of predication, first, and the second is the combination of 2 and 4, that is quiddity as including matter. And the reason he says that is, for example, the individual parts of a human are not themselves separate substances. Rather, the human is one substance. So you don't exactly have the substance of an arm and a leg, but the whole thing is the substance. In Aristotle's categories, there is primary / first substance and then second substance. And by the way, when I just said categories to talk about those, that list of four, I was not meaning category in the technical Aristotelian sense, but now to deal with Aristotle's categories, there is the primary / first substance, and then there's second substance. An individual human, for example, is first substance, but belongs to the human species, which is second substance, which belongs to the genus animal, which is also second substance. Essence is not identical to subject in the matter-form compositions. So Socrates is not mankind, he is a man. But in non-material subjects, essence and subject are identical because no matter to individuate, there's no matter to individuate that one common nature as there would be for that which is a matter-form composition. This leads to the problematic of how can substance be subject? Well, on the one hand, it needs no extrinsic foundation. It simply subsists. So it passes the criteria of the four modes of being as being of being per se, rather than being in something else. And second, it is the support for accidents, which also passes the test of the four modes of being. And therefore, in those two senses, subsisting and supporting, it is logically differentiated as subsisting, it is subsistencia, and as supporting accidents, it is hypostasis. But these two differ merely logically. They actually refer really metaphysically to the same substance. And for you remember in Aristotle's Metaphysics 7, he talks about the four modes of substance. First, quiddity, essence, nature. Right? Second, the universal. Third, the primary genus. And fourth, the subject of which other things are predicated, but which is not predicated of anything else. In Aristotle's categories, the second substance stand under accidents alone. For example, man is white. That's second substance only insofar as this man is white, as an example of first substance. So whereas for the physics, matter can be known through the study of motion, Thomas Aquinas is actually going to be like Kant or precede Kant by deducing the categories as logical analogs of the modes through which being is realized. That's actually how we derive the 9 supreme classes of accidents and how we divide being into 10 supreme categories or predicaments. So, although in medieval metaphysics there are 10 categories, you have to keep in mind that each one refers to the same something. For example, if you have the first category, substance, and you say this is a man, the second category, quality, you say this man is white, the third category, quantity, this man is one. You then have predicates that can relate to a subject in 3 ways. First, truly identical, for example, Socrates is an animal. Second, something in substance, like a quantity. Quality is in the subject, but it follows from the form. Relation arises from the substance's relation to something else. And therefore, the predicate may be derived from something realized outside of the subject. If you take the 6th category, habitus, which is kind of like clothing, a being is clothed with X, but is still distinct way of speaking of the subject. The 7th is time. Subject is in time. That's the when, and of course the place where is the location, right? 8 is position, which is place plus the situated relations of body parts relative to one another. For example, Socrates is sitting. The 9th is action, which is not separate so much as it is out of the subject. And the 10th is to be acted upon. Once again, these 10 are all identical with the subject or derived from something present in the subject or derived from something external. But although Thomas Aquinas gives a similarity to Kant in methodology, he is still going to drastically differ from Kant in that for Kant, the categories are just pure concepts. But because Aquinas is working from a medieval perspective metaphysics, the categories really do reflect the order of being and therefore have a properly metaphysical character to them. For example, Aquinas expands Aristotle's list by adding habitus and situs, which is position. But being is not a genus. The 10 are not species of the genus being, but rather 10 modes. For example, substance, which is kind of a form-matter composite, can have a quality at the level of modifying form, and quantity as a matter of modifying matter, and relation as the relation between one substance and another. And you can map the categories in that sense of, for example, quality is relative to form, quantity is relative to matter, and substance 1 is in relation to substance 2. Therefore, to be named from something external can be either by causation or as measured by another thing. As to causation, it's not material or formal causation because both are intrinsic to the essence of the substance, but rather from the efficient cause. For example, passio is to be acted upon, or actio is to produce an action separate from the substance. As regards measurement, it can be intrinsic or extrinsic. Intrinsic measurement, for example, is height, width, depth, and extrinsic measurement is time and place. You may find it strange that Thomas Aquinas uses habitus as a category, which deals with clothing. The reason for that is that all the other animals already have all the parts needed for survival included in substance. For example, an animal doesn't have horns, claws, teeth as separate substances. Rather, the whole animal is the substance. But because humans have reason, that allows them to use tools, which allows for another category, habitus, which has to be considered as something other than just substance. Therefore, the precise definition of substance and accident is substance is that which exists in itself, and accident is that which exists in something else. Of course, the notion of substance, accident, and esse is going to be quite complicated for Thomas Aquinas. For example, if esse is the act of being, then obviously there is a notion of esse in the individual subject who has a share in the act of being. But what about the being of accidents? Is there accidents and accidental esse? What about the causal relation between substance and accident? What about the soul and all of its powers? So, as I mentioned earlier, for members of a species, a given nature is realized in each, but in material that is individuated for each one. This is how you can have many different rhinoceroses that are all of the same species, but for immaterial angels, that is not going to work. That's why there is no such distinction for them between nature and the supposite individual. Therefore, mankind does not subsist, rather, given persons do. Therefore, nature can only supply the essential principles. It's up to substance to be something distinct which subsists in itself and includes all that is found in a thing.